Hey everyone, welcome to the Retention Edge podcast. I'm your host, Nihal, head of growth here at MobileOut. And this is the show where we sit down with people shaping great customer experiences in e-commerce and retail. We talk with everyone, marketers, CX professionals, merchandisers, agency owners. And we're generally interested in the strategies and ideas that keep customers engaged and coming back. Today we have with us Omer, managing director at Atlas Studios, all the way in New Zealand. Welcome to the show, Omer.
Thanks, Nihal. Yeah, great to be here.
Me a little bit about what you do, how you came up with Atlas Studios, why you started it, and yeah, give me a bit about yourself.
Sure. So I'm also the founder of Atlas Studios. Founded it about a year and a half ago, nearing 2 years actually now. And previous to Atlas Studios, I was part of another agency. So I've always been agency side, working kind of mid-market to enterprise. And basically, I started Atlas Studios with a goal of delivering impeccable client service with market leading expertise and work. I saw the previous agency that I was at and the amazing work they did. As they moved further up market, I saw an opportunity within kind of that lower mid market level for retailers in the kind of 2 to 25 million annual revenue range, and the lack of expertise they often got. So especially when it comes to the Shopify ecosystem and integrations possible with the ERPs, with their POS systems, and choosing the right systems, and the total cost of ownership implications, and all sorts of stuff. So we started there, and all we do is around Shopify and Shopify Plus ecosystem, CRO, UX, UI, and retention marketing, obviously with Klaviyo, with some Yotpo, recharge, Skio, subscription bundling, reviews, all that great stuff. And I'm sure we can talk a lot more about those.
Yeah.
But yeah,
absolutely. No, that's awesome. And how as far like these different services that you do offer, is there one that you're currently looking to scale, or are you trying to grow on all your service offerings?
it's a funny one. I think it really is across all service offerings. Retention is always a great channel to grow. However, lately we're seeing a lot more projects come through in the Shopify builds, Shopify migrations. A few legacy brands approaching us lately. They've been around since the 1990s, and they're on a legacy WooCommerce system with a legacy ERP, and they're trying to move into the kind of Plus ecosystem. So consulting and then scoping and then building those out. Those are pretty exciting projects. They take longer, but we're seeing those come through a lot more recently. But retention, we're looking to grow across the board, and I think we do a good job of that so far.
I'd imagine part of the concern when brands are maybe moving over as part of these migrations is maintaining their brand equity and making sure that it's a smooth transition, I guess, both for the team as well as customers. What are some of the biggest concerns you usually hear brands talk about when it comes to migration?
Depends. I think there's often a lot of merchants typically see migrations as a black box of what does it entail, what do we need to be aware of. I think is often the starting conversation. So a good scoping and education process is crucial. A lot of our scoping is done initially before we even present a proposal, and I think you need to do that. Otherwise, you're opening yourself up to scope creep from an agency side, but also for the client side. They might have a hard go live date. You don't want to be missing those. You don't want to be halfway through the project telling them that it's going to now cost 50% more. Right. So we do kind of scope quite heavily, but often a part of that is understanding, customer migration. So merchants are worried, will they retain their data from customers, orders, product? Now, depending on the system they're using, whether the architecture will remain the same, whether the data fields that we're using remain the same. Often it's not the same architecture when it comes to Shopify. So how variants versus how different SKUs are housed, and are they variants? Are they different products? Are we linking them? Are we not linking them? Filtering options. I think there's a lot to cover there, and that typically becomes the biggest concern. I think anything UX design wise, it is sometimes things merchants think about, but I think it's a lot easier to show them that great, we will keep the brand ethos, right, and redesign will only involve XYZ. So I don't see it as being that big. Like the data piece typically is the largest question when it comes to it.
No, that's very good. Just interested, not trying to turn this into a ERP and migration podcast. So when planning for our chat today, really what I wanted to dive into with you was call it rethinking retention, right? What's broken, what's coming up, and why acquisition alone as a focus for brands is not really enough anymore, right? And
Mm,
to this point, I feel like retention, loyalty has generally been a huge buzzword in ecom for the longest time, right? I find brands will always say, "Oh yeah, we're focused on retention as a brand," but sometimes it's lip service, right? There's a pretty big
mhm.
gap between looking at it from a strategy level and what they actually do at the end of the day. And I'm sure, both with your customers and just keeping an eye on the scene, you've seen that some brands are really nailing it while others maybe are just following like an influencer's playbook. I suppose in your experience and what you're seeing in the market, what are some of the big shifts that you've maybe seen in the past year or two? And what do you think is actually moving the needle for customers or for brands at this time?
Mm, mm. Great question. And I absolutely share your sentiment that I think there's a lot of hoo-ha in the space, and people get bogged down with things that don't actually move the needle or things that don't really matter. I think ultimately it comes down to, are you solving your consumers' problems and are you meeting them where they're at to make it easy to keep coming back to you, right? Um, you could have the best product, um, but if you're constantly out of stock and you're having stock issues, and let's say this is a want business, right? So let's say you're selling, and this is a real example. Actually, I was speaking to a friend of mine who they run a supplement business. Amazing brand, amazing community building. It's probably one of the examples I often give
Mhm.
when I talk about good community building in New Zealand with merchants, and
You
they're
could
having
shut the
stock
boat
issues.
if you want.
Ugly Face. Yeah, sure. They're
Okay.
called Ugly Face, and
Okay, so
I think they've done a lot of things very well when it comes to affiliates, and they call them their athletes, and it's a
mm,
great kind of brand building exercise there. Great products, genuinely. The ingredients are amazing, and they're all locally sourced. They go above and beyond, etc., etc. Now, the issue is they kind of moved manufacturers, and due to that, they're having stock issues. Now, although they've got all that amazing brand building and
mhm,
retention, because they're out of stock. Now, if someone is a bodybuilder, they go to a gym 5, 6 times a week.
yeah,
Even if they're not a bodybuilder, they go to the gym all the time. They run out of protein. Even if they love your brand, if you just don't have it in stock, they might wait a few days.
yeah,
And if you don't have like a back in stock notification, or they have no idea when it's going to come back in stock, they're just going to go somewhere else, right? And so retention ultimately, really, I think, comes down to that question of, are you solving your customer's problem? Yes. Okay. Well, are you meeting them where they're at in those channels? So
mhm,
online, retail, email, app notifications, etc.
mhm,
And then are you making it easy for them to come back to you? And if there's a disconnect anywhere there, I think that ultimately kind of breaks down. So I
yeah,
think the biggest shift I've seen as part of that is direct consumer brands focusing more on retail expansion. They're noticing that, okay, just that kind of online experience isn't always enough if you want to keep scaling with retention in mind. So you got to
yeah,
be where your consumers are at. You got to be in retail shelves and kind of be there to keep capturing their recurring revenue. So
yeah,
I think that's quite important. I'm seeing that shift happen a lot more. Previously, it was really cool to be a D2C brand,
yeah,
online only. Whereas, I think over the past few years, really post COVID, up until COVID, even during COVID, it was like online only. But I
yeah,
think post COVID, I'm seeing the shift back into, oh, okay, we've got to be in retail shelves. We've got to have more of a presence.
yeah. I think it's a really great point around CX as a whole, right? Like a customer experience across different touch points, meeting customers where they are. And it's interesting you mentioned retail because I feel like that's always been in a way like the black sheep of D2C, right? It's like, oh, like retail's dying, like D2C forever. And while it's true, I do think obviously it's a very efficient channel for certain types of products. There are definitely additional things you can do in person that
Mhm.
maybe aren't necessarily direct conversion plays, but they
Yeah.
build on the brand. They give people something tangible to associate with. And I really like this thinking around, if you're a brand trying to survive and grow and thrive, moving forward, the days of just like pouring everything into Meta and building a $20 million brand off that are like limited, right? If not kind of ending or like coming up on their end. And I think something like a retail channel for brands feeds into that customer experience that you kind of mentioned, right?
Yeah.
I guess building off of that, what are some things you feel like brands love to invest in currently that I wouldn't quite say is overrated, but is maybe not as important as customers maybe or even clients come to you being like, hey, we want to do this thing, but from what you're seeing, it's not the most important thing that they should be focusing on, right? When it comes to brand growth.
Yeah. I think loyalty programs, really, right? And I think there's a big space for loyalty programs. And don't get me wrong. I mean, yesterday we just launched a loyalty program for one of our clients, right, with Yoppo. Now, if a loyalty program or a paid membership program is rolled out as part of a overarching retention strategy, there is a lot of communication, there's a lot of information building, there's a lot of community involvement, planning, hype, and it's a multi-step, multi-week, multi-month process to get there to launch, and then there's an ongoing strategy post-launch. It can be very efficient and can be a great retention tool.
Right.
However, I think a lot of merchants, especially on the smaller end, tend to kind of go, oh, we can just install smile.io from the Shopify App Store and launch it in 10 minutes, and now we have a loyalty program. Right. And I think that often is where it fails. It's not a successful channel for retention. It will not help you with retention. And you will see it if you do a rollout like that. If you slap it together, your redemption rates will be minimal, sub 1%. Your engagement with the program will be minimal. So, however, if it is rolled out good, it can be great. So I think I think people love to invest, and merchants love to invest in loyalty programs. They hear about them, they want to inquire about it and learn more. But I think the challenge often is to really educate and understand what it entails, rather than just potentially installing an app and quote unquote launching it. You know what I mean?
Right. No, absolutely. I think loyalty as a term historically had this connotation of, we'll just install this app, spin up a points-based loyalty program, and we're done. Our job's done. Let the money roll in. But I think to your point, it really is, how are you using it because it's a tactic, right? It's not a silver bullet. So how are you using it as a tactic within your entire retention strategy in a way that actually resonates with your customers, right? And maybe for some customers, points are enough, but for others, it needs to tie into other brand experiences, right? To actually drive utilization, like you kind of mentioned.
Yeah.
And I think there's some really cool ways that even using tools like Yotpo, but tying it into a brand experience rather than just purchase, right? Where it's like especially for example with the retail expansion, maybe it's things like visit us at one of our booths and get rewarded for that as a loyal member, right? So I think there's quite a few things that folks can think about there.
Absolutely. And sorry to interrupt on that point. It's even with a point-based loyalty program. So the one we launched yesterday was Thomas Sabo, the Australian site. And although it's a point-based program with Yoppo, there are a lot of amazing things when it comes to the different tiers and the spend, and free jewelry cleaning services and extended warranties and additional exclusive invites to pop-up events and IRL events. So that's when it really becomes that kind of overarching program where you're offering just more than get points, redeem points for discounts, right? That's when it becomes really, free charms on X per purchases. So there's, and all of that requires more thinking. All of that requires more integrated business processes, right? Because if someone emails one of your customer support staff, hey, I want to redeem my free jewelry cleaning service. Well, everyone's going to be aware of this. Everyone's going to know what the process is of doing that. So they're a bit more involved, but I think that's where the magic is.
Absolutely. I think that's also an underrated part of the customer journey, I think, is just having your entire engine running in a way that's geared towards delivering a great experience for your customers, right? And even some of the other recordings I've done, I talked to Henry, who's the head of design director at Mack Weldon, right? So kind of classic menswear. And it was really interesting to hear about the role the design team and the merchandising team plays in ultimately giving your end customer a good experience with your brand, right? And as marketers, I find that we tend to discount the impact that other departments have in delivering that experience, right? We're like, yeah, it was my email that drove all these results, right? But there's so many moving pieces that build into that. And obviously, I'd imagine do quite a bit of consulting, maybe even just like discovery calls with brands. And let's say a new brand came to you today and mentioned, we're struggling with our retention. We've been trying to find things to fix, but we don't know what to do. Where do we start? What would you say would be, you or your team's first course of action when approaching, call it a retention problem that a brand has?
Sure. I think it's twofold. First is always, because retention is so overarching, I think it's about identifying where in that retention journey is a retention breaking down, right? It just depends on how aware a merchant is of their issues. If they're completely not aware, that's a standard. You'd go down an audit process and go, okay, well, are you even doing the basics correct? And let me tell you, I've seen 8-figure brands who global. They're in retail stores, omni-channel, and they will be missing basic email flows. They will be running their pop-ups with no delays, and they will not be utilizing SMS at all, if not sometimes not very efficiently. The deliverability metrics will be a bit low. So it's really just like making sure do you have the basics. Now, where I personally find a lot of excitement is when they already have the basics. So they're doing things well, but there's still a retention issue. And that's where I love jumping into the weeds and kind of figuring out, okay, well, how do we break this down? So one of the things I love doing when it comes to that problem is looking at where in that journey people are breaking down. So typically conducting an RFM analysis. If a merchant is high 7 figures, if not 8 figures or more, where you're looking at where's that retention dropping off, with what cohorts, with which segments, across which products, right? And that's when it becomes really interesting. You can see, okay, well, our problem is obviously not the first purchase, and even the second purchase is often at a good rate, but it's really post that. Let's say purchase 1 to 2 might take on average 27 days, and that's in line with your kind of planning. And then 2 to 3 might be again like 28, 29, but in 3 to 4 might now be 68 days. Okay, well, there's a real gap there. There's a real issue there. What is happening? Let's dive deeper and understand, is there not enough nurturing happening with some of your post-purchase flows, with some of your repeat purchase flows? Is it that you're completely relying on discounting those first 2 purchases? So now you're actually reiterating this idea that
they should wait.
Be shopping with you based on discounts. So, it's really interesting conducting some of those analyses and seeing what comes up. And often you will find an inflection point where if you can get a customer across purchase X, they tend to be kind of loyal customers with you for a lifetime. And it's finding where that inflection point is and throwing a lot of resources at getting them to that stage. Yeah. Now, I guess if you're on the smaller end of that, because again, for an RFM to make sense, you got to be at a scale. You got to go, okay, well, here are all the numbers. And if we do these slight changes incrementally on a percentage basis, it adds up. Now, if you're a smaller brand, and by smaller, you could still be a 4 or 5 million annual revenue brand, it might not be the most cost efficient thing to do. So in that case, I'd I really love going down a user survey route. Ask your customers thoughts on how they're feeling about brand purchases, etc. I love using no commerce on that, so you could just plug them in. I believe they also help a lot with figuring out those questions and kind of how you can get the juice. So yeah, I think that's probably a good place to start as well. Just survey your customers, identify the issues, and then move on to fixing them. But you got to identify the issue first. If you just go, we have a retention problem, and our repeat purchase rate is below an ideal number we want, that's not enough. You really got to go a bit more granular there and figure out where exactly that issue lies.
Yeah, no, and I really think it's interesting to mention this idea that there's these blockers where if you can get a customer over this roadblock, they're much more likely to continue to purchase from you. I just hopped off a call with a customer and he kind of mentioned the exact same thing. He's like, what we've seen is if we get our customer to complete purchase number 3, their average jumps from 3 to like 9, right? And so it's something that I think, you obviously have a ton of agency experience. You've worked with a ton of brands. And I think that's why you have this awareness of that kind of consumer behavior. Well, maybe with smaller brands or brand scaling, or even with larger brands, they never really think of retention as this long-term sustainable growth play, right? And even though we kind of hear all the time that retention ultimately is cheaper than acquisition, right? You've spent the money, you've done the work, you have them in your funnel, you have the retention. But then what we see, and maybe you run into this issue too, and trying to talk retention to customers, is a huge chunk of budget for a lot of brands tends to go into acquisition, even when they have a really solid base that they can build from. And maybe this is my personal bias, but I always find that teams focused on retention, your lifecycle marketers, your email marketers, the folks driving, 40, 50, 60% of your revenue, they're often seen as like second fiddle, right? To like acquisition teams, right? In some ways, like, and I guess, why do you think that brands are, I don't want to call it addicted, but, there's this prevalent thinking I find, especially in e-com and D2C, that acquisition at all costs, right, to some degree. And maybe it's shifted a bit more nowadays because of the economic environment and the cost of like CAC's like ridiculous. But there's still a little bit of this focus where people are always trying to optimize this top of funnel, even though retention is where true profitability lives, right, to some degree. Curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah. I think this is a topic that we could be here for hours. I've got a lot of thoughts on
a
lot
of nuance, yeah.
Yes. So I think it ultimately boils down to, well, first of all, I think there's an innate belief that once you have a customer, that's your job done. They're just going to come back and buy from you again, especially if you truly believe and you do have a good product, right? So typically then management, directors, or people really setting the targets and kind of in charge of budgets go, great. If we can get the customer to even try the product, to buy the product once, they'll keep coming back to us because the product is that good. Right. Now, that isn't always the case, but there is that innate belief. Now, I think that lends itself to the psychological phenomenon as well. So I think there's a lot of psychologies in play here. And I see this in my industry as well, right? Agencies tend to focus on sales, but often neglect looking after their existing clients, right? Like once they sign the dots, great, on to the next one. Like who else is out there? What else can we be getting? And I've seen countless agencies use that model and have a big rise and then kind of crash and burn. I think the most successful agencies that I've kind of seen, and I think this ultimately is brands as well, are service or product providers that also focus on their existing clients or customers or consumers. and it's this psychology of just chasing the next shiny thing, right?
Yeah.
And however, I think most growth does come from your existing clients or customers. So in a brand, in a D2C space, it is from your existing customers.
Mhm.
It's a lot cheaper to keep keep an existing customer than keep acquiring new customers. It's a much better brand exercise. You can get referrals out of them. You can get reviews out of them. The benefits are just tenfold. And similar in my industry, it's a lot easier to build those long-term relationships with our clients and become the go-to partner for anything e-commerce.
Mhm.
If we can't provide it, great, we'll recommend you someone. And just being that trusted advisor and partner, where a lot of our growth comes from existing client growth because they trust us and then we do good work. And we don't really focus on sales. It just kind of happens as a secondary thing. So now I don't know how much of that applies to a brand, if they should just not care about acquisition
Mhm.
at all. And I think that's also an incorrect way to think about it. There is, and there should be,
Mhm.
room for acquisition as well as retention. But
Absolutely.
you can definitely push it too far on one end or the other. You can push it too far with just retention, and you can push it too far with just acquisition. So I think the good operators are the ones who can become aware of this bias
Mhm.
and take a balanced approach to focusing on acquisition and retention, and then knowing when to pull those levers. Because for a specific period of time, your acquisition might become a lot more important,
Yeah.
aka Black Friday, Cyber Monday period, right? That in the year Q4 period, pump the lever on acquisition. Again, I think since we're not acquisition experts, I think there's also debate on whether if that even is a good time to acquire because it's so expensive.
Yeah.
So I'll leave it to those experts to answer that question. But there are times when you should be focusing more on acquisition, and
Yeah.
then perhaps post BFCM Q1, you should be actually focused on, okay, well, we spent all this money acquiring these customers, how to retain them
Yeah.
into throughout the year and into next year. So it's knowing, the good operators know when to pull those levers. And if they don't, they kind of seek that help from people who might know or kind of work together on that. So yeah, it's a big topic. And I think, like I said, this is how we can go
We'll do a
so many ways
second
in some
recording.
directions. Yeah, yeah.
No, it's a great. I definitely think that's totally the case. At a panel we were at last week, kind of raised the same question, right? It's how do you get brands to think about that balance a bit more, where acquisition is important, but once you've done the work to acquire that customer, you should also do the work to keep them, right? And really striking that balance. When it comes, you kind of mentioned something about brands potentially taking it too far in either direction. I'm curious if, from some of the analysis or conversations you've had, certain warning signs that maybe hint that a brand is focusing, maybe in this case, since this is retention, too much on acquisition and is about to hit a wall, with focusing too hard on that.
I don't think you often need rocket science for this one. A good starting point is always just looking at your classic metrics. What's your repeat purchasing rate? Benchmark it against industry. If you're a furniture brand, your repeat purchase rate is going to be very different to a CPG, there where you would expect people to buy monthly or maybe even weekly, fortnightly. So look at that, benchmark it against industry. I think following that, looking at your engagement metrics across email, across SMS. If you've got very low open rates, very low click rates, and as a result, very low placed order rates, there's probably some sort of issue there. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean it's the issue is this. It just opens a conversation to start thinking about what an issue could
Mm-hmm.
be, because it could be brand related, it could be so many different things.
Yeah.
So, but at a high level, kind of looking at those things, again, if you are running any sort of RFM analyses and you're tracking that, looking at the curve. Are you typically moving customers into the champions and loyals
Right.
segment? Or is there more of a downward flow into kind of at risk and churned customers, right? That often, and this is why I'm a big believer, and I always tout kind of most brands should be conducting RFM analyses, and they're not. But this is a great way to see, okay, are you, from a retention point of view, once you acquire a customer, do you tend to move them upwards? So they are repeat customers, they are spending more, they're spending more recently, they're spending more frequently, and they're spending more on True Value, right? Or are they kind of becoming at risk and you're kind of losing them after X amount of days? And that's a very good indicator immediately, I think, to see. So a few things there from Shopify. Look at your repeat purchasing. From Klaviyo, your email programs. Look at your engagement rates. And then from, again, from a strategic point of view, I think you can look at your RFM and your cohort movement.
Yeah, very good breakdown. It kind of seems like you sometimes have to have these somewhat difficult conversations with customers, and sometimes it's hard to sell the long game, right? I think we kind of see the same thing in our case, where when it comes to priorities, mobile app is usually, call it number 5 on their list, right? And we're obviously hoping to change that, and we have the numbers to back it up. But I guess, how do you usually approach helping brands shift their mindset a little bit to think more long term while balancing some of these short term wins that they're looking for? Or I suppose, is there anything you've found when you have really dug into their pain points where you're able to just be like, hey, you mentioned this is a problem, let's focus on that, right, as your first step towards a more retention focused mindset?
Yeah, I think ultimately it could be based on the market, it could be based on many different factors, but recently I think I'm actually seeing that the market is waking up to more of the long-term benefits over short-term goals. I think they're realizing the importance of certain retention strategies in the marketing stack and in the planning and in the target planning, quarterly budgets. I don't see as many brands walking kind of blind post COVID as they did pre or kind of during COVID, where it was just kind of, for lack of better terms, like a gold rush, where you just funnel money into acquisition and kind of try and capture as much as much attention as possible. And if you're the first one there, then you did it. I think over the past few years, due to macro, due to economic conditions, I think there is more of this focus on these long-term benefits. So I'm personally not seeing that challenge. Now, I think, again, this could be due to trust that ultimately gets built with merchants. When you recommend something, they go, oh, yes, yep, sounds good. And I think this is often just we approach it from different levels, right? As an agency and as a kind of consultancy and partner agency, that is our kind of unique selling point, is we become their trusted advisors and partners. So there's that inherent trust when we say, hey, you should use an app. They go, okay, great, what do we do? Versus, I think, vendors such as yourself, or like providers often, I think our merchants often will go, hey, this provider has emailed us or approached us. I feel like they're selling to us, like, do we need it? And like then they kind of ask us, and we say, yes, you should. That's when they kind of take go with it. So I think it's just different. We sit in different kind of discussions with merchants.
It's definitely something. Yeah, no, I agree. And I think we kind of see it like, we've really shifted how we even do our sales from very close first mindset to more of a consultative approach. And I think the difference is like night and day, right? Where when you can actually be that voice of reason, just educating the customer about what's good for them, and then kind of letting them come to their own conclusions about whether this is something that's for them or not, works way better than trying to, call it just shove numbers and potential outcomes down their throat, right? No, cool. I guess, talking about apps, we like I kind of mentioned, we see the numbers, right? Apps are a great retention tool. They drive more retention, higher engagement, more LTV. But for a lot of agencies, they're still not a default recommendation. And a lot of brand side, customers, I feel like don't even think about an app necessarily as part of their retention stack. I guess from your side, why do you think that there's this misconception maybe that an app is just a nice to have rather than a core part of your overall communication strategy? Kind of going back to what you'd mentioned around meeting customers where they are, right? The reality is a portion of your user base are just naturally app users, and part of that behavior also equates to loyalty, right? They're app users because they're loyal users. So yeah, curious why you maybe think there is this slight aversion to the channel. Yeah.
I think it's because it's often seen as a hard thing to do. Um, it's funny. I feel like typically, and I think this is again this mindset is changing. But a few years ago, even trying to explain why a very integrated Shopify Plus site might cost north of $50,000 was hard to explain. Whereas now, kind of people understand all the kind of work that has to go into it. Especially if you're doing custom design and etc. etc. I think that kind of awakening hasn't really happened when it comes to mobile apps, and I think. So merchants, I think, are still thinking of this as a hard thing to do, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're thinking, well, okay, I've spent $20,000 to $100,000 on my website, and they're probably thinking, well, okay, I got to do this again now for an app, and so then part of that's the initial cost. They're thinking, well, who's managing the channel now? What is the total cost of ownership of this? Not just the initial investment.
Mm-hmm.
And I think then going back to that loyalty program launch topic, you can't just kind of just install it and launch it and call it a day. You really have to do the same thing. You have to really make a business case of how you're going to go to market with your app. You can't just deploy and hope people install. Like, that's not a strategy. So what is the go to market? What is the communication strategy? What is the management strategy moving forward? Oh, cool, it might not be actually as hard as they're thinking, but there still has to be someone who's focusing on this. Who is responsible for the push? Is it your retention agency? Is it your in-house e-commerce managers? So there's a lot of things here to think about. It's not as complex as merchants think. So I think the problem is merchants often think it is way more complex than it is. But then when they realize, oh, it's not as complex as I think they go down the other end of the spectrum where they think, oh, okay, we can just install this app and it's live and it will cost us way less than what we thought. Well, no, there has to be that kind of middle ground of kind of that middle ground. You have to have that good planning. You have to have that good management kind of plan ongoing. But it's also not going to be as complicated as you think it is.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think especially the way we build and, the way we're trying to educate merchants that, hey, it's true. You've invested all this time, effort, and energy into building a really good mobile site experience. You can just use that as your app and you'll see all the great results you want. So yeah, I definitely think it's interesting you say that it's the second set of problems, maybe secondary, right? Now, okay, we've solved the cost and ease of getting the tool. The next set of problems to solve for is how do we help them see that they're going to be successful with the tool, right? It's because you mentioned it's maybe then at that point the management and internally selling it. Like the problem is actually more in that line, right? So, I guess you mentioned push, and we see it as a really strong additional communication channel on top of email, SMS, direct mail, whatever else brands are doing. But brands and agencies barely use them, right? They barely use them. They don't really explore it as this next frontier, I suppose. What's your take? Is there a reason push, for example, hasn't really been a part of your offer set when you're thinking about it for customers?
So I think with merchants that do have apps, maybe they're not doing push very well, but there tends to be like the occasional push, which again isn't a strategy, but they do use it. I think where push isn't utilized is when they just don't have an app, right? So it's kind of this conversation where if a client, and this doesn't really happen, but in this hypothetical, they're a massive brand, they have never done email. Now, that is a much kind of harder launch, or not harder, but it's a much more kind of involved and costly
Hmm.
launch to set them up and then roll out an ongoing email strategy than if they were already on Klaviyo and they just need someone else to kind of manage it now, right? And
Absolutely.
I think the barrier typically is that the merchants don't even have an app to do push with. So then the barrier is, hey, we need to launch this app
Hmm.
first, then start running push as an ongoing strategy. And rather than, hey, you already have an app, let's take over push. Because when that's the case, that is a very easy addition to the overall retention scope of, hey, look, we're looking after your email, we're looking after the end-to-end design
Hmm.
strategy, QA deployment, scheduling. Let's add push to that. Let's add SMS to that because you already are in these channels. But even SMS is a similar thing, right? If a merchant isn't set up with SMS, there's usually more of a barrier to get them across it. If they already have SMS, for us to go, hey, you're not doing it as well, let's kind of help you do that better. Typically, merchants tend to be more and more into it.
Yeah.
There's already that buy-in. There's probably already that internal belief that, cool, we want to exploit SMS, we're kind of doing it. It's the same with that and push. If they already have an app, they probably have
It's
already
easy.
bought into
Yeah.
this notion that, okay, this is beneficial.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a funny one there. I don't know
The,
how to
the
like.
the demand's there. I get it. Like it's they already have been sold on the value of a channel. Now they're just trying to make
Yeah,
it work, right?
yeah,
Versus selling them on a whole new channel. It's a
yeah.
different topic. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, maybe two final questions before we wrap things up. But I'm sure you working with all these different brands have seen retention evolve over the years, right? And I think there's always been this concept of owned channels and owning your
Mm,
audience, right? And that's why we have very robust email programs, SMS, mobile apps, and I think they're all becoming more critical as you know cost of getting new customer goes up, and maybe even just people are spending less, right? Do you find that brands, for the most part, are fully tapping into, let's say, each of these channels, or do you find there's big gaps in general, even with maybe your larger customers?
big gaps for sure. It goes back
Yeah,
to the initial discussion, right? You'll go in to do an audit or you get access to do some scoping before starting an engagement, and you can just immediately see the basics that are not being done.
yeah,
Um, Another, Clivia keeps releasing new features and, CDP Advanced Analytics, which I think now they've kind of moved into more of the CRM approach, is such an important, powerful tool that whenever we've
mhm,
done any audit that's utilized that was amazing, mind blowing for these merchants, kind of getting those insights. But I have not seen a single merchant that was already using it before they joined us, right? No matter their size or scale, and that's just on the email front. SMS, same thing. Mobile apps, same thing. And general retention, same thing. It might be a merchant that lends itself amazing to a subscription program. They don't have
right,
one.
right.
It might be a merchant that lends themselves amazing to kind of cross selling, upselling, and bundling promotions and gift with purchases and all this stuff. They don't do it, right? So a big, massive gaps. I think retention, because there's so many different elements to it, has we would see a lot of gaps
Yeah.
with merchants.
No, makes sense. I've definitely seen these even with brands we work with, where
Mm.
we'll go in and I'll give them advice on other channels because I'm like, why don't you do this? Because yeah, we're your mobile app provider, but if you add this to your site, we'll also perform better.
Yes.
Um, no, that's great. And I guess if you had to make one bold prediction about retention life cycle marketing, say in the next year or two, what do you think that would be?
Mm. A year or two
Yeah.
is an interesting one. In a year or two, I think nothing
Could be
major.
5 if you want to be
Yeah,
if you want to
yeah.
be more
Let's kind of
perspective.
go
Yeah,
down.
let's go to 5.
Yeah, yeah. So a year or two, I think we're just going to keep seeing more and more unification of data with approaches like Klaviyo moving into more of a CRM, and and this was already happening a few years ago, and it's super cool to see this trend continuing. But this unification of data, this when you are looking at retention, it is and life cycle marketing.
Mhm.
It's knowing more and more data, having more and more data points on your customers across different channels that might not necessarily be through your retention channels. So it might not just be your app or email or SMS, but it's looking at how are these people performing across your store activations,
Mm-hmm.
across your site, obviously, across the products they're purchasing, etc. Over a 5 year period, I think there's going to be a very interesting shift to hyper personalization at scale
Mm-hmm.
that isn't a gimmick, and that actually works. So, what I mean by that is currently you can like, what are other personalization pieces that you have? It's really, let's think Klaviyo, dynamic name fields, dynamic X, Y, Z. You can get a bit more interesting. Let's say you're integrating with your loyalty program, you can start to dynamically display how many points they have. So a bit of personalization. Then you've got tools like Search Spring that start to display potentially similar products to what you might have purchased before on site. So on site personalization at scale, and that's all great. But imagine a scenario, and this was a thought exercise, but actually Louis Vuitton did this. But again, it's Louis Vuitton with global resources,
Yep.
where they had sent out an email and they allow for for your initials to be on their products, right? And they sent out an email to all their customers with one of their bags or luggages with that person's initials on it.
Yeah.
So, right, but on the product
image.
Well.
Yeah.
And
Cool.
for me, it would have been O.H. And obviously, all the kind of retention people kind of started jumping into it and going, "How do they do this? Okay, they probably hosted the images on this kind of the initial images, and then they probably created all the possible variations. So A B, A C, and then they're dynamically attached it to the first name, last name field, blah 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 blah." And then something like that is so cool, right? It adds so much hyper personalization. However, unless you're at a global company with global resources, it's just not feasible to do for majority of brands. I think we're going to start seeing that become a lot more accessible with AI and kind of all of that. So that's going to be really interesting to kind of watch and witness, and even the way emails are set up and the segmentation that's going to be present. Again, that's a whole nother, I think, call in and of itself. But yeah, I think over the 5 year period, we're going to see it not just be a gimmick, but actually used. I think over the next few years, it'll become a gimmick. It'll become a thing that LinkedIn bros talk about and say, hey, you can do this hyper personalization, but it won't be usable. I think in the kind of 5 year period, it'll probably be usable, and that's when it gets very exciting.
No, that's really awesome. I totally agree, and I think we can set up a different episode to dive into that. Well, I mean, thank you so much, Omer. I guess before we wrap things up, anything you want to shout out? Anything you want to share?
No, I appreciate you inviting me. I love nerding out on all things retention. So it's always great. And I know that you and I have been chatting for a while, and I think retention is such an important channel, and which is why when I started Atlas was one of the reasons we decided to really specialize in it. And that's what we started off as. It was just a retention agency that then kind of went into Shopify, because again, they go hand in hand. It's not really, nothing is really siloed. And, that's when we met and started looking at, okay, well, how do mobile apps play in that retention stack? And anyway, so it's super exciting topics. And yeah, so I do appreciate you having me on here, having the opportunity to talk about this. And I guess what I'd shout out is Mobilad, and I would shout out Atlas Studios as well. If you're looking at retention strategies, Shopify scoping, Shopify Plus scoping, let's have a chat. A lot of the way I do business is just jumping on calls, figuring out where opportunities might be present. If there is, great. Let's put something together for you to review. No obligation, nothing. And then if there isn't, we'll tell you there isn't, right? So yeah, just reach out. Let's have a chat. Like I said, I love talking about it, so we can brainstorm, and if something becomes something, that's great. But anyway, yeah, thanks so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ryan.